I'm standing on my wraparound porch, coffee steam curling in the morning air, admiring 8 months of backbreaking work that transformed this rotting Victorian mansion into something beautiful again. The smell of fresh paint mixes with lake breeze, loons calling across the water, pure peace. Then this woman in a Honda Civic screeches into my driveway like she owns the place. She marches up to my front door, doesn't even say hello, and slaps a manila envelope in my face. Inside, a bill for $47,000 in back HOA dues dating to 1975, before I was even born. "You owe us 50 years of fees," she says with this fake sweet smile. "Plus interest. I just spent my entire inheritance saving this place from demolition, and now some stranger thinks she can extort me for money I never agreed to pay. What would you do if someone tried to steal your dream with a piece of paper? Where are you watching from? And does your HOA have one of these power-hungry tyrants? Let me back up and tell you how I got here. My name's Ezra Blackwood, I'm 52, and 6 months ago I was living in a studio apartment above my electrical shop in Milwaukee, wondering where the hell my life went wrong. The divorce took the house, the savings, and most of my faith in fresh starts. The smell of sawdust and old wood stain from my workbench became my only comfort. At least tools don't lie to you or leave you for their yoga instructor. Then my great-aunt Cordelia's lawyer called. She'd left me property in Willowbrook Bay, Wisconsin. "Lakefront," he said, like that meant something. I figured it was a rusty trailer on swampland. Boy, was I wrong. The first time I saw the mansion, I had to machete through sumac just to reach the front door. 3-story Victorian beauty with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch that belonged in a magazine, if magazines featured houses that raccoons had been using as condos for 15 years. The crunch of broken glass underfoot became my morning soundtrack, and the musty smell of water damage could knock you flat from 50 feet away. But underneath all that neglect was solid gold. Original hardwood floors, hand-carved moldings, and windows that had been watching over Lake Geneva since 1923. 8 months I spent bringing her back to life. Every weekend, every vacation day, every spare dollar of my $85,000 inheritance. I rewired the entire electrical system myself, and let me tell you, 1920s wiring makes spaghetti look organized. The locals called it a teardown. I called it potential with really good bones. Neighbors started stopping by with coffee and compliments. The newspaper ran a feature. Lakefront mansion rises from ruins, and fresh paint smell mixing with lake breeze became my new favorite perfume. For the first time since my divorce, I was building something instead of watching it crumble. Then she showed up. Delilah Pemberton Cross emerged from a silver Lexus wearing designer clothes disguised as weekend casual. You know, the kind of outfit that costs more than most people's car payments, but looks like she just threw it on. 58, with hair styled within an inch of its life and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "What a charming restoration," she said, clutching a manila folder. "I'm Delilah, HOA president for Willowbrook Estates. Such a shame about the confusion with your property." I looked at her like she'd started speaking Klingon. "Ma'am, there's no HOA on my deed. I researched everything." Her smile tightened. "Oh, sweetie, sometimes these old properties slip through the cracks, especially when, well, previous owners weren't exactly familiar with proper community standards." The way she said it made my skin crawl, like I was some outsider who couldn't possibly understand how things worked in their little kingdom. She handed me the folder. $47,000 in back dues since 1975, plus $350 monthly going forward. I'm sure someone in your profession can work something out. My profession? I'm a licensed electrician with 20 years of experience, but the way she said it made it sound like I collected garbage for a living. Inside the folder were bylaws, fee schedules, and architectural guidelines I'd never seen. At the bottom, a payment demand that would drain my remaining savings. "This has to be a mistake," I said. "County records show no liens." "Well," she interrupted, already backing toward her car, "mistakes happen when people don't understand local customs. 30 days to respond. Welcome to the neighborhood." She drove off, leaving me holding a bill for money I didn't owe for a house I'd legally bought and lovingly restored. That night, I spread every document from my property purchase across the kitchen table. Deed, title insurance, survey maps, county records. Nothing mentioned an HOA, not one word. But standing there in my restored mansion, I realized this wasn't about dues or regulations. This was about power. And apparently I'd just painted a target on my back by having the audacity to succeed where they expected me to fail. 3 days later, a certified letter showed up with enough postage to mail a small refrigerator. Inside was a formal demand for payment within 30 days, complete with threats of lien placement and additional legal remedies as deemed necessary by the association. But here's the kicker. She'd CC'd the letter to every neighbor within a half-mile radius, with a little handwritten note suggesting I was experiencing financial difficulties following a recent divorce. Classy, right? Nothing says welcome to the neighborhood like having your dirty laundry aired by someone who doesn't even know your middle name. That's when I decided to fight back. If Delilah wanted to play games, I'd damn well learn the rules. My first stop was the county courthouse, a building that smells like old coffee and broken dreams, where the fluorescent lights hum like angry wasps and the clerk looks like she's been fossilized since the Carter administration. I spent 6 hours digging through property records, HOA filings, and historical documents until my eyes burned and I'd consumed enough courthouse vending machine coffee to power a small town. But I struck gold. The HOA was formed in 1975 by Harold Pemberton, Delilah's daddy, and buried in those original documents was something beautiful. My mansion property was specifically excluded due to pre-existing ownership and historical significance. Not only was I not part of their little club, I was explicitly protected from being forced to join. I remembered something from my divorce lawyer. Wisconsin doesn't let people force you into associations without your written consent or a court order, period. You can't just wake up one day and decide your neighbor owes you money because you formed a club and printed some fancy letterhead. I photocopied everything, drove home feeling like David who'd just found the perfect stone for Goliath's forehead. But Delilah wasn't done escalating. 2 weeks later, she organized an emergency HOA meeting about the rogue property owner threatening community standards. The community center smelled like burnt coffee and anxiety, folding chairs squeaking under the weight of worried neighbors like a symphony of nervous joints. She'd prepared a whole PowerPoint presentation about how my non-compliance could affect everyone's property values. "We have standards here," she announced, clicking through slides that somehow made my beautifully restored mansion look like a crack den. "When outsiders ignore our established community values, it hurts all of us financially." Outsiders. There was that word again, delivered with the subtle poison of someone who'd perfected the art of saying terrible things with a smile. She spread rumors that I might be planning to turn the mansion into a party rental or, God forbid, some kind of Airbnb, because apparently a divorced electrician from Milwaukee couldn't possibly want to live peacefully by a lake without ulterior motives. The community split like a broken wishbone. Newer residents, the ones who'd bought into Delilah's vision of suburban perfection, nodded along with her presentation. But the older folks, the ones who remembered when the mansion was occupied and beautiful, stayed quiet, though a few shot me sympathetic looks that said, "We've been here before." That's when I met my secret weapon. After the meeting, a tiny woman with white hair and fierce blue eyes approached me. "You're fighting the right fight, son," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived 8 decades of nonsense. "I'm Bertie Kowalski, town librarian for 43 years before I retired. That house has been fighting off the Pembertons since before you were born." Bertie became my research partner and unofficial grandmother figure. She had a photographic memory for local history and access to archived documents that made the county courthouse look like amateur hour. Plus, she made coffee strong enough to strip paint, which I needed, because we had serious work ahead. But Delilah's next move was her biggest mistake yet. A week after the community meeting, I came home to find an official-looking notice taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Violation: unauthorized architectural improvements without HOA approval. The fine? $500 per day, retroactive to the start of my renovation 8 months ago. I did the math while standing in my driveway, calculator app glowing in the evening light. They were claiming I owed them $122,000 in violation fees for the crime of fixing up my own house with my own money. The notice was printed on fancy letterhead with enough legal jargon to choke a lawyer, complete with references to architectural review committees and compliance procedures that sounded impressive but had about as much legal weight as a paper airplane. Standing there with that bogus violation notice fluttering in the lake breeze, I realized Delilah had made a crucial mistake. She'd gone from threatening legal action to actually taking it, and that meant she'd have to prove her authority in court. Problem was, she didn't have any authority to prove. The smell of fresh paint and possibility that had been my daily comfort was starting to feel like the calm before a very ugly storm. Delilah's next move came with the subtlety of a freight train carrying fireworks. She hired a law firm, Pemberton, Cross & Associates, which turned out to be her late husband's old practice. Nothing says conflict of interest like paying yourself to threaten your neighbors, but apparently ethics were as optional as turn signals in a BMW dealership. The cease and desist letter arrived on letterhead so thick you could use it as body armor. It demanded I stop all unauthorized activities on my property and submit to an immediate inspection for community safety violations. The threat was crystal clear: comply or face a lawsuit that would make my divorce settlement look like a friendly game of Monopoly. But I'd been doing my homework too. Bertie and I had been burning the midnight oil in the town library's basement archives, surrounded by boxes that smelled like mothballs and forgotten municipal secrets. That's where I stumbled across something called equitable estoppel, a legal principle I remembered from my divorce proceedings. Basically, if property taxes were paid without HOA assessments for decades, it creates precedent that the property was never part of the association. My mansion had been paying full municipal taxes, including fees that covered the exact same services the HOA claimed to provide, since the 1960s. The next morning, Delilah showed up for her inspection with a clipboard thicker than a phone book, and her nephew Todd, who she introduced as a certified building inspector. Todd looked about as qualified to inspect buildings as I was to perform open-heart surgery while juggling flaming torches. The kid was maybe 25, wearing a polo shirt with a name tag that looked suspiciously like it came from a Subway sandwich shop. "We need to verify your electrical work meets HOA standards," Delilah announced, marching toward my front door like Napoleon approaching Moscow. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. "Ma'am, I'm a licensed electrician with 20 years of experience, and HOAs don't have authority over municipal building codes anyway." Todd pulled out a flashlight and started poking around my electrical panel like he was conducting an archaeological dig. After 5 minutes of theatrical squinting and note-taking that would make a mime jealous, he declared several potential violations that any first-year apprentice could tell you were textbook-perfect installations. "This junction box placement seems irregular," he said, pointing to a perfectly standard setup. "That's installed exactly per Wisconsin Electrical Code Section 110.26, I replied, pulling out my phone to show him the actual regulation. "Would you like to see my inspection certificates from the county?" The look on Todd's face was absolutely priceless, like a deer caught in headlights while trying to explain quantum physics to Stephen Hawking. Delilah quickly stepped in, declaring the inspection preliminary and promising a full report within the week. But that's when the real harassment campaign began. Over the next few days, anonymous complaints started flooding the city building department like confetti at a New Year's party. Noise violations during normal working hours. Unpermitted electrical work, despite my having every permit properly filed and county inspected. Allegations that I was running an unlicensed business from my home. Every morning brought a new complaint, and every afternoon brought a city inspector to my door. The sound of official vehicles crunching up my gravel driveway became as regular as the loons calling across the lake, except a lot less peaceful and a lot more expensive for the taxpayers funding these wild goose chases. Each inspector found the same thing. My work exceeded code requirements, my permits were in perfect order, and somebody was wasting everyone's time with frivolous complaints that had about as much merit as a $3 bill. The third inspector, a weathered guy named Mike who'd been doing this job since Bush was president, the first one, pulled me aside after his visit. "Look, I don't know what kind of neighborhood politics you've stepped into, but these complaints are complete garbage," he said, mopping sweat from his forehead in the humid afternoon air. "And this isn't the first time we've seen this exact pattern. 3 other property owners in this area have faced identical harassment campaigns in the past few years." That was my light bulb moment. This wasn't personal, it was systematic. I started asking around, carefully, quietly. Turns out Todd Granger faced the same playbook in 2019. Sarah Mitchell got the treatment in 2021. Frank Kowalski, Bertie's own nephew, endured it in 2023. All newcomers. All eventually sold below market value rather than fight a legal battle they couldn't afford. But I had advantages they didn't: professional expertise, historical allies, and the kind of stubborn streak that comes from having already lost everything once. When you've hit rock bottom, you learn it's actually a pretty solid foundation to build on. Sitting on my porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the lake gold while honeysuckle perfumed the air, I realized Delilah had just handed me her entire playbook. Big mistake. Delilah's next escalation crossed a line I didn't even know existed. She filed an actual lien against my property, despite having zero legal authority to do so. But here's the dirty trick. Her family law firm had connections at the county clerk's office, and they fast-tracked the filing before anyone could review whether it was legitimate. The impact hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. I couldn't refinance, couldn't sell, couldn't even get a home equity loan to finish some final restoration work. My property was essentially frozen until the lien got resolved, which could take months or years if it went to court. But Delilah had underestimated my secret weapon, Bertie Kowalski, and her encyclopedic knowledge of local history. The next morning, she showed up at my door carrying a cardboard box that looked older than both of us combined, with the musty smell of decades-old paper, and the kind of excitement that only retired librarians get when they've found buried treasure. "I've been digging deeper," she said, setting the box on my kitchen table with a satisfying thud. "And I found something your HOA queen doesn't know exists." Inside were documents from the town archives dating back to 1975, including the original HOA charter that specifically excluded legacy properties over 50 years old from forced membership. But here was the kicker. There was a 1978 amendment, misfiled under historical preservation instead of property law, that granted my mansion perpetual exemption status due to its historical significance. The amendment was signed by Harold Pemberton himself, Delilah's own father. Apparently, my great-aunt Cordelia had threatened a lawsuit over the forced inclusion, and Harold caved faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The legal principle of grandfathered property rights meant pre-existing properties couldn't be forced into associations without explicit written consent, and this document proved I had explicit exemption. "Why would Harold give in so easily?" I asked, studying the signature that looked suspiciously shaky for a man supposedly in control. Bertie's eyes twinkled with the kind of mischief that comes from knowing where all the bodies are buried. "Because Cordelia had evidence that the Pembertons used the HOA formation to hide some creative bookkeeping during their 1970s financial troubles. Nothing illegal, mind you, but embarrassing enough to make Harold very cooperative." This was game-changing ammunition. I could end Delilah's harassment campaign with a single document. But Bertie warned me to be careful. Cornered animals are dangerous, and the Pemberton family had a long history of making life difficult for people who challenged them. I decided to hold my fire and let Delilah dig her hole deeper. That decision paid off 2 days later when I walked out to my driveway and found my electrical service truck vandalized. All 4 tires slashed, windows spider-webbed with cracks, and "Outsider" spray-painted across the side in letters big enough to read from space. The sharp smell of rubber and the sound of broken glass crunching under my boots made my stomach turn, not from the damage, but from the realization that someone had been on my property in the middle of the night. Thank God I'd installed security cameras after the harassment started. The footage showed a figure in dark clothes and a baseball cap systematically destroying my truck with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. The face wasn't clear enough for positive identification, but the build and movement pattern looked suspiciously like Todd, Delilah's nephew and fake building inspector. I filed a police report, though I knew it wouldn't lead anywhere without clearer evidence. But it created an official record of escalating harassment, which my lawyer friend Marcus Rivera told me could be useful later. The financial impact hit immediately. I lost 3 regular commercial contracts within a week. Apparently, word had gotten around that hiring me might complicate customers' relationships with their own HOAs. Delilah had organized a whisper campaign suggesting that supporting me could put other property owners at risk of similar harassment. It was economic warfare disguised as community protection. But the vandalism backfired in an unexpected way. My neighbor Jim Castellano, who'd been staying neutral in the whole mess, saw the damage and got pissed off on my behalf. His wife Jenny worked for the local newspaper, and suddenly they were very interested in doing a deeper investigation into HOA abuse in the area. The evening after the vandalism, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching storm clouds gather over the lake. The air smelled like rain and electricity, the kind of summer storm that clears the air and makes everything feel possible again. Lightning flickered in the distance, and I counted the seconds until thunder rolled across the water. Delilah had just made her biggest mistake yet. She'd escalated from legal intimidation to actual property destruction, creating evidence of criminal harassment. And she'd given me a newspaper ally who specialized in exposing exactly the kind of small-town corruption that thrives in shadows. The storm was coming all right, but it wasn't heading for me. The next morning, Bertie showed up at my door at dawn with 2 steaming cups of coffee and the kind of expression that meant she'd found something big. The smell of her industrial-strength brew mixed with the morning mist rising off the lake, creating the perfect atmosphere for what she was about to tell me. "I couldn't sleep last night," she said, settling into one of my porch chairs like she was about to deliver a state secret. "That 1978 amendment kept bothering me. Why would Harold Pemberton, the man who built his family's power through that HOA, suddenly give your great-aunt a permanent exemption?" She pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been rescued from a fire. So I went back to the archives at 3 in the morning, perks of having keys to everything in this town, and found what I was really looking for. The document inside made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. It was a notarized affidavit from 1978, signed by Cordelia Blackwood, detailing financial irregularities in the original HOA land transfers. Apparently, Harold Pemberton had used the association's formation to hide the fact that his family was essentially bankrupt, transferring personal debts into HOA assessments and using new member fees to pay off old creditors. "Your great-aunt was a retired accountant," Bertie explained, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. She spotted the creative bookkeeping immediately and threatened to expose the whole scheme to the state attorney general unless her property was permanently exempted from HOA jurisdiction. I read through the affidavit twice, my electrician's brain trying to process the financial engineering Harold had pulled off. It wasn't technically illegal, just ethically bankrupt and embarrassing enough to destroy the family's reputation if it became public knowledge. "But why didn't Cordelia just expose him anyway?" I asked. "Because she was a decent woman who believed in second chances," Bertie said. "Harold cleaned up his act, the HOA became legitimate, and Cordelia kept the secret, but she kept the documentation too, just in case. The affidavit was filed with the county clerk as insurance, cross-referenced to the 1978 amendment that granted my property its exemption. For 45 years, it had been sitting in a misfiled folder waiting for someone to connect the dots. This changed everything. I didn't just have legal ammunition to stop Delilah's harassment. I had nuclear weapons. The document proved that the Pemberton family's entire local power structure was built on financial quicksand, and that my property had been explicitly protected from their reach for nearly half a century. But looking at Bertie's worried expression, I realized this was bigger than just winning my fight. "If this comes out, it doesn't just hurt Delilah," she said quietly. "It destroys the family legacy Harold spent decades rebuilding. Her kids, her grandchildren, they'd carry this shame for generations." I stared out at the lake, watching a great blue heron wade through the shallows with patient precision. The morning sun was burning off the mist, revealing the clear water beneath, and I found myself thinking about truth and consequences. I could quietly present the exemption document and end the harassment without mentioning the financial scandal. Or I could expose the whole corrupt history and make sure no one else ever faced what I'd been through. "What would you do, Bertie?" She was quiet for a long moment, sipping her coffee and watching the heron stalk its breakfast. "I'd remember that justice isn't just about winning," she finally said. "It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same battle." That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to just save myself. I was going to save everyone who came after me. The truth needed to come out, but I'd do it in a way that focused on protecting future victims rather than destroying past villains. Delilah had scheduled an emergency town hall meeting for next week, hoping to pressure me into submission with community support. She was about to get a very different kind of meeting than she'd planned. The heron struck with lightning precision, coming up with a fish that gleamed silver in the morning light. Sometimes patience and preparation are all you need to get exactly what you've been waiting for. The next 48 hours felt like assembling the world's most important heist team, except instead of robbing a casino, we were planning to liberate an entire community from decades of legal bullying. My kitchen table became mission control, covered with documents, legal pads, and enough coffee cups to stock a diner. First, I called Marcus Rivera, a young lawyer fresh out of UW-Madison who'd been recommended by my divorce attorney. Marcus had that hungry look of someone still idealistic enough to take on fights that mattered more than they paid. When I spread Bertie's documents across his desk, his eyes lit up like a kid seeing his first Christmas tree. "This is beautiful," he said, photographing each page with the reverence of someone documenting ancient artifacts. Wisconsin property law is crystal clear on this. Equitable estoppel prevents any organization from claiming retroactive fees after decades of non-enforcement. The burden of proof shifts entirely to the HOA to justify why they waited 50 years to collect. Marcus explained it in terms even a simple electrician could understand. Imagine your neighbor suddenly demanding you pay for using their driveway for the past 20 years when they'd never mentioned it before and you'd been maintaining it yourself. Courts don't let people sit on their rights indefinitely and then spring surprise bills on unsuspecting property owners. Next, I brought in Jenny Castellano from the local newspaper. She'd been quietly investigating HOA abuse patterns across Wisconsin after seeing what happened to my truck, and my story was exactly the kind of David versus Goliath narrative that sells papers and changes minds. "I've been documenting similar cases statewide," she said, pulling out a folder thick enough to stop bullets. "The Pemberton pattern shows up in at least 6 other Wisconsin communities where the family has business interests. Legal intimidation, manufactured violations, economic pressure. It's systematic." Jenny had already reached out to Todd Granger, Sarah Mitchell, and Frank Kowalski, the previous victims of Delilah's harassment campaign. All 3 were willing to attend the town hall meeting and share their experiences publicly. Suddenly, my individual fight was becoming a class action reckoning. Bertie coordinated our research like a military intelligence operation. She'd spent her career organizing information, and watching her work was like seeing a master craftsman build a perfect cabinet. Every piece fitted exactly where it belonged. We created a timeline of harassment incidents, a family tree showing the Pemberton business connections, and a simple chart explaining Wisconsin property law that even the most HOA brainwashed resident could understand. "The key is presentation," Bertie explained while organizing evidence folders. "People tune out when they're overwhelmed with details, but they pay attention to stories. We tell your story, then show how it fits the bigger pattern." Marcus discovered another ace up our sleeve. Delilah's law firm had a massive conflict of interest representing the HOA while having direct financial stake in the outcome through family connections. The Wisconsin State Bar's ethics rules were clearer than lake water on a calm day. Lawyers can't represent clients when they have personal interests that conflict with their professional duties. "We could file a grievance that would shut down their practice," Marcus said, but I shook my head. The goal wasn't destruction. It was justice with a side of prevention. The smell of fresh printer ink filled my dining room as we prepared visual aids for the town hall presentation. Charts showing the legal precedent, copies of the historical documents, and photographs of my vandalized truck that would make the criminal harassment impossible to ignore. Jenny arranged for the meeting to be recorded, ostensibly for the newspaper's coverage, but actually to ensure everything was documented for potential future legal proceedings. She also quietly contacted the sheriff's department about providing security, not because we expected violence, but because official presence tends to keep everyone honest. We rehearsed the presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. The strategy was simple. Let Delilah make her case first, give her enough rope to hang herself with overconfident claims, then systematically dismantle every argument with historical fact and legal precedent. "Remember," Marcus coached during our final practice session, "stay calm, stick to facts, and let the documents do the heavy lifting. When you're holding a royal flush, you don't need to bluff." The night before the town hall, I sat on my porch with a beer, listening to the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs. The smell of honeysuckle drifted on the warm air, mixing with the faint scent of wood stain from some touch-up work I'd been doing on the porch railings. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, and the air had that electric feeling that comes before thunder. Delilah thought she was walking into a friendly crowd ready to pressure me into submission. Instead, she was about to face a community that finally understood the pattern of abuse she'd been running for years. Tomorrow, the truth would finally come out. And sometimes, that's all the justice you need. Delilah must have sensed something was wrong because her next moves reeked of desperation and panic. Word travels fast in small towns, and apparently she'd caught wind of my growing legal team through the same gossip network she'd been using to spread rumors about me. Her response was to file an emergency injunction claiming my mansion posed imminent threat to community safety and property values. The legal filing read like something written by someone who'd watched too many lawyer shows on TV. Lots of fancy language that meant absolutely nothing, but designed to sound scary enough to freeze any reasonable person in their tracks. The injunction claimed I was operating an unlicensed electrical business from my residential property, potentially creating fire hazards that threatened neighboring homes. Never mind that I'd never run my business from the mansion, or that every electrical outlet in the place had been inspected and approved by the county. When you're desperate, facts become optional. But the real escalation came 3 days before the town hall meeting. I walked out to check my mail and found my electrical service shop's power had been mysteriously disrupted during the busiest repair season of the year. The utility company claimed it was scheduled maintenance, but the timing was suspicious as hell, especially since no one had bothered to notify me in advance. The power outage hit during a brutal heat wave when half the county needed emergency AC repairs. I lost $3,000 in emergency service calls I couldn't fulfill because my diagnostic equipment, parts refrigeration, and office systems were all down. When you're an electrician, losing power isn't just inconvenient. It's like a surgeon losing their hands. Security footage from the neighboring business showed a figure matching Todd's build near the electrical junction box around midnight the night before the outage. The image wasn't clear enough for criminal charges, but it was obvious someone had been tampering with equipment they had no business touching. Marcus filed a motion ensuring the town hall meeting couldn't be moved or postponed because Delilah's legal team was suddenly claiming the community center had been double booked and suggesting we move to a smaller private venue where they could control attendance. The motion cited Wisconsin's open meeting laws, which are stricter than a nun's rule book when it comes to public access. But Delilah's most pathetic move was the smear campaign she launched through anonymous flyers distributed around town like confetti from hell. The flyers questioned my electrical licensing, easily disproven with one phone call to the state, and suggested I might be running some kind of financial fraud scheme with the mansion restoration. One flyer showed a grainy photo of my divorce paperwork with personal details highlighted in red marker, suggesting that someone who couldn't even maintain a marriage shouldn't be trusted to maintain property. The smell of cheap copy paper and desperation was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The flyers backfired spectacularly. Instead of turning people against me, they made the community realize how far Delilah was willing to go to destroy someone who dared to challenge her authority. Several neighbors stopped by to apologize for the invasion of privacy and express their disgust at the personal attacks. Meanwhile, I maintained radio silence. Marcus had coached me to document everything but respond to nothing publicly. Every harassment incident went into our evidence file. Every illegal action was photographed and time-stamped. Every threat was preserved for potential criminal charges. The silence was driving Delilah crazy. She'd escalated from polite intimidation to outright warfare, and I wasn't taking the bait. It's hard to fight someone who refuses to fight back, at least until they're ready to end it permanently. 3 nights before the town hall, she made her most desperate move yet. I was working late in my home office when motion sensors triggered, and my security cameras caught her and Todd attempting to break into the mansion's back door. The footage showed them with flashlights and what looked like lockpicks, clearly searching for something they could use against me. They didn't get inside. I'd upgraded all the locks after the truck vandalism, but their intent was crystal clear. Delilah was so desperate to find dirt on me that she was willing to commit actual felonies to get it. I called the sheriff's department and filed a report, adding breaking and entering to the growing list of criminal charges that could eventually land both of them in orange jumpsuits. The deputy who took the report looked at the security footage and shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am, I've seen property disputes before, but this is next-level crazy," he said, ejecting the evidence DVD from my security system. "You might want to consider a restraining order." But I had a better idea. Let Delilah keep digging her hole deeper. Every illegal action she took strengthened my case and weakened hers. By the time the town hall meeting arrived, she'd have built her own prison cell with her bare hands. The air that night smelled like rain and reckoning. Storm clouds were gathering, and the wind carried the electric promise of things about to change forever. With 48 hours until the town hall meeting, Delilah pulled out every dirty trick in her playbook like a magician performing her final, most desperate act. She organized a caravan of supporters from neighboring HOA communities, promising reduced fees and special considerations to anyone willing to pack the meeting and support her position. The parking lot was going to look like a convention of luxury SUVs driven by people who'd never set foot in Willowbrook Bay before. Jenny's newspaper connections tipped me off to Delilah's media manipulation attempt. She'd contacted the local TV station with a sob story about a rogue property owner, threatening to destroy community standards and property values. Her spin portrayed herself as a beleaguered community protector standing against an aggressive outsider who refused to follow basic neighborhood rules. The irony was thicker than the morning fog on Lake Geneva. Here was a woman who'd spent months criminally harassing me, painting herself as the victim because I had the audacity to defend my legal rights. But Jenny had stronger media relationships than Delilah realized. When Channel 8 showed up to cover the story, they got the full picture: vandalized trucks, illegal break-in attempts, fraudulent legal filings, and a pattern of systematic harassment spanning years. The reporter, Sarah Indigo, had won awards for exposing municipal corruption, and she smelled a real story underneath Delilah's carefully crafted narrative. In a last-ditch attempt at damage control, Delilah tried to bribe me into submission. She showed up at my door with a leather folder and the kind of fake smile that politicians use when they're about to screw you over. "I've been thinking about our situation," she said, settling into my porch chair without being invited. "Perhaps we've both been a bit rigid in our positions. What if we could reach a compromise that works for everyone?" The generous offer was $15,000 plus ongoing monthly fees of $150 instead of $350. She framed it as a community harmony settlement that would allow us to move forward together as neighbors. I listened to her pitch with the patience of someone watching paint dry, then gave her my response. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I don't negotiate with terrorists. And that's essentially what you've become, someone who uses fear and illegal intimidation to get what they want." Her fake smile cracked like old paint. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Blackwood. This community has ways of dealing with people who don't fit in." "Is that a threat?" I asked, my phone already recording the conversation. She backpedaled faster than a cyclist going downhill. "Of course not. I'm simply saying that cooperation tends to work better than confrontation in small communities." After she left, I added the bribery attempt to our evidence file. In Wisconsin, trying to extort money through legal intimidation is a felony, and we now had her recorded making threats on my own property. The night before the town hall, Delilah made one final attempt to control the narrative. She organized what she called an emergency pre-meeting at her house, inviting all her supporters to coordinate their talking points and ensure a unified message. The meeting was supposed to be secret, but Todd, who apparently had the discretion of a broken fire hydrant, posted about it on social media. Jenny's photographer happened to be in the neighborhood that evening and captured images of the gathering through the windows. The photos showed easels with prepared charts and talking points, clearly demonstrating that Delilah's spontaneous community concern was actually a carefully orchestrated performance. Meanwhile, Marcus discovered that the HOA hadn't filed proper registration paperwork with the state for 3 years, making all their recent enforcement actions potentially invalid. When organizations fail to maintain their legal status, they can't enforce contracts or collect fees. It's like trying to arrest someone when you're not actually a police officer. "This is prosecutorial malpractice," Marcus said, reviewing the state filing records. "They've been operating as a legal entity without actually being one. Every fine, every demand letter, every threat they've made could be considered fraud." But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Frank Kowalski, Bertie's nephew and one of Delilah's previous victims, had been quietly building a class action lawsuit against the HOA for their harassment tactics. My case had given him the courage to go public, and suddenly we had legal standing to sue for damages on behalf of everyone who'd been victimized. As I sat on my porch that final evening, the air smelled like rain and justice. Lightning flickered in the distance, and I could hear thunder rolling across the lake like an approaching army. The storm that had been building for months was finally ready to break. Tomorrow, Delilah would walk into that community center expecting to steamroll another victim into submission. Instead, she was going to face a community that finally understood the truth about her reign of terror. The wind picked up, rustling the trees with the promise of change. Sometimes you have to let the storm build until it's strong enough to wash away everything that needs cleaning. The Willowbrook Community Center had never seen a crowd like this. By 7 o'clock, every folding chair was occupied, and people were standing along the walls like witnesses to a public execution. The air buzzed with nervous energy and the smell of burnt coffee from the ancient percolator that had been working overtime all evening. You could practically taste the tension. Delilah had arrived early with her entourage, setting up a professional PowerPoint presentation complete with charts, graphs, and the kind of visual aids that scream, "I spent way too much money trying to make this look official." She wore her best battle armor, a navy blue blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and the kind of smile that politicians practice in mirrors. The surprise was the media presence. Jenny's newspaper photographer was there, as expected, but Channel 8's news crew had shown up with cameras and everything. Sarah Indigo, their investigative reporter, had positioned herself where she could catch every facial expression and document every word. This wasn't going to be the quiet community meeting Delilah had planned. "Ladies and gentlemen," Delilah began, clicking to her first slide with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. "We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's property values and standards." Her presentation was a masterclass in manipulation, charts showing declining property values due to non-compliance, photos of my mansion that somehow made it look shabby despite 8 months of meticulous restoration, legal citations that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing when you actually read them. "When outsiders refuse to follow our established community guidelines," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority that comes from years of unchallenged power, "it hurts every single family in this room financially." There was that word again, outsiders. She delivered it like a verbal slap, making sure everyone understood that I didn't belong in their perfect little kingdom. The crowd murmured approval, heads nodding like dashboard bobbleheads. Her supporters from neighboring communities applauded on cue, creating the illusion of overwhelming community support. For a moment, I almost admired the performance. Then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room like morning mist on the lake. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone, and I appreciate the chance to share my side of the story." I started simple. A timeline of events that anyone could follow: the inheritance, the restoration, the first demand letter. I showed photos of the mansion before and after, letting the transformation speak for itself. The crowd began shifting in their seats, seeing the obvious care and investment I'd put into the property. "But there's something else you need to know," I said, nodding to Bertie, who stood up in the front row like a general preparing for battle. She walked to the front of the room carrying the archive box that had become our secret weapon. The musty smell of old documents mixed with the coffee and anxiety, creating an atmosphere thick enough to cut. "This is a 1978 amendment to the original HOA charter," I announced, holding up the document like a winning lottery ticket. "It specifically grants my property permanent exemption from HOA jurisdiction. Signed by Harold Pemberton himself, Delilah's father." The sound that came from the crowd was like air being sucked out of a balloon. Delilah's face went from confident pink to corpse pale in the span of a heartbeat. You could have heard a pin drop in the next county. "That's impossible," she stammered, her perfectly practiced composure cracking like ice in spring. "That document doesn't exist. This is fraud." But Marcus was ready with verification. "The document has been authenticated by the county clerk and cross-referenced with state archives. Mrs. Pemberton Cross, your family's law firm, has been operating without proper authority for this entire harassment campaign." That's when the floodgates opened. Todd Granger stood up and described his 2019 harassment. Sarah Mitchell detailed her 2021 nightmare. Frank Kowalski explained how the same tactics had driven him to sell below market value. The pattern was undeniable. The systematic abuse finally exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Jenny revealed her investigation into similar patterns across Wisconsin, showing how the Pemberton family had used legal intimidation in 6 other communities. The sheriff's deputy in attendance started taking notes, clearly recognizing criminal harassment when he saw it. Delilah's desperate counterattacks only made things worse. She accused me of manipulating elderly Bertie, forging historical documents, and threatening community safety, each claim more hysterical than the last. The crowd turned against her like a tide reversing direction. Then came my mic drop moment. "I didn't just restore a house," I said, looking directly at Delilah while the cameras rolled. "I restored the truth. And sometimes that's the only renovation a community really needs." The applause started slowly, then built like thunder rolling across the lake. Even some of Delilah's imported supporters were clapping, finally understanding they'd been used as props in someone else's power play. The meeting ended with a spontaneous vote to remove Delilah from the HOA presidency and launch a full investigation into years of illegal harassment. Justice tastes sweeter than morning coffee on a perfect lake day. The aftermath moved faster than summer lightning across Lake Geneva. Within a week, all liens and claims against my property were officially dismissed, and Delilah resigned from the HOA presidency in a letter so bitter you could taste the defeat through the paper. She blamed community ingratitude and outside agitators. Apparently, I was simultaneously an outsider who didn't belong and an outside agitator who'd corrupted her perfect kingdom. The new HOA leadership, elected by an 80% majority, issued a public apology that felt like a community-wide exhale after holding its breath for years. They implemented transparency reforms that would make future harassment campaigns impossible, including an independent review board and a requirement that all enforcement actions be backed by actual legal authority, revolutionary concepts apparently. But the real magic happened when my mansion transformed from a private retreat into the heart of our community. The wraparound porch that had witnessed so much conflict became a symbol of reconciliation, hosting everything from morning coffee gatherings to evening strategy sessions for local improvements. The smell of fresh-baked cookies from neighbors' kitchens mixing with lake breeze became my new favorite aromatherapy. We launched the annual Willowbrook Heritage Days Festival, celebrating local history while raising funds for community projects. The mansion serves as festival headquarters, with my restoration story displayed alongside artifacts from other historic properties. Last year's festival drew over 2,000 visitors and funded new playground equipment that echoes with children's laughter every evening. I established the Cordelia Blackwood Trade Skills Scholarship in my great-aunt's honor, partnering with the high school to teach traditional building trades and restoration techniques. Watching 18-year-olds learn to wire historic buildings properly while preserving architectural integrity gives me hope that these skills won't disappear like common sense in an HOA meeting. The mansion also became an environmental education center where students learn sustainable restoration practices. The lakefront property demonstrates how to preserve history while protecting the future, proving that progress and preservation can dance together instead of fighting. My electrical business exploded after the David versus Goliath victory became local legend. I never repainted the vandalized truck, just added a sign explaining how community support rebuilt it stronger than before. That rolling advertisement books more jobs than any Yellow Pages ad ever could. Jenny's newspaper series about systematic HOA abuse won a state journalism award and prompted Wisconsin legislators to strengthen oversight laws for homeowner associations. Sometimes fighting for what's right in your own backyard ends up protecting everyone's property rights across an entire state. The personal healing surprised me most. 6 months after my divorce left me feeling like damaged goods, this community embraced me not because I fit their mold, but because I'd proven that standing up for principles matters more than fitting in. Saturday morning coffee on the mansion's front steps has become an unofficial town hall where neighbors solve problems together instead of creating them. My dating life even improved. Turns out, women find defeated corrupt HOA president in public showdown surprisingly attractive. Who knew that legal victories were better than expensive cologne for attracting quality partners? Tonight, I'm watching sunset paint Lake Geneva in shades of gold and redemption while the sound of loons calling across the water reminds me that some things are worth fighting to preserve. The smell of wood smoke from backyard fire pits mixes with honeysuckle, creating the perfect soundtrack for a community that learned to choose cooperation over control. The legal battle taught me something invaluable. Thorough property research, documented evidence, and community alliances can defeat even the most entrenched bullies. Property records don't lie, but people who profit from intimidation certainly do. Sometimes the best weapon against systematic harassment is simply refusing to be silently victimized. Speaking of refusing to be victimized, wait until you hear what happened when my neighbor Marcus bought that old farmhouse where the previous owners claimed there was a ghost clause in the deed requiring monthly seances. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. Here's what I need from you. Drop a comment sharing your worst HOA or property management nightmare. Some of these stories are so outrageous they could power their own episodes. And if you're hungry for more tales of ordinary people using research, determination, and community support to demolish impossible odds, Smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for HOA tales, because we're just getting started exposing the petty tyrants who think they can push people around. Sometimes the best renovation isn't what you do to a building, it's what you do to the bullies who try to tear it down.